Good morning and good day. Welcome to 3:15 o'clock, that very channel where the unspoken becomes unforgettable. Do you have the courage to explore the stories they always wanted to hide from you? This is not just a horror channel. This is a place where silence is shattered by secrets, and every story carries a weight of fear it was never meant to bear.
The first story, the monitor showed a flat line of my heart, but I could still hear someone breathing loudly behind the screen. The air froze in my lungs, turning into a lump of stabbing ice. I blinked, trying to clear the sticky film from my eyes. Everything was blurry. The ceiling with its matte shades, the faded blue curtains, the ghostly outlines of medical equipment. I was lying on my back. My body was heavy alien, saturated to the bone with the chemical cotton wool of anesthesia. But I could feel the cold starch of the sheet under my fingers, a dull aching pain deep in my abdomen, and that sound, a monotone, piercing, relentless beep. It came from somewhere above and to the right. I turned my head with effort, and the world tilted. A green screen, on it a smooth, lifeless straight line. I knew what it meant. I'd seen it in dozens of TV shows. A flat line means the end, silence, death. But I could hear that beep. I could feel the pain. I could see. My heart didn't start pounding in response to the panic. It just kept beating steadily, lazily, somewhere deep inside, completely out of sync with the soul-chilling proof on the monitor. I tried to raise my hand, to touch my face, my chest, but my fingers only twitched, bumping against hard restraints. And then my hearing, sharpened to an animal acuity, picked out another sound. Right here, in this dimly lit room, breathing, deep, wet, with a whistle on the inhale and a gurgling rasp on the exhale. It came from behind the thin white screen separating my bed from the next one. Someone was there, someone very close. "Nurse," I tried to say, but only a hoarse, indistinct sound escaped my throat. "Who's there?" In response, only that breathing. It seemed so loud it drowned out even the obsessive beep of the monitor. It filled the space, crawled into my ears, and lay on my chest like a heavy weight. The screen was made of a thin, light-filtering material. I could make out a vague shadow on the other side, tall, unfocused. It wasn't moving. It was just there, and breathing. Panic, sticky and sweet, rose in my throat. I tried to scream again, to move, but my body was a traitor, paralyzed and silent. A new shadow appeared in the doorway. A nurse walked in, an older woman with a tired, gaunt face. She walked slowly, muttering to herself, checking a tablet. Her gaze slid over my monitor, over that same flat green line. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't rush to save me. She just sighed, as if seeing something annoying but familiar, and made a note on the electronic chart. Her fingers poked lazily at the screen. The monitor's beep continued. I'm alive, I hissed, gathering all my willpower. The nurse looked up at me. There was no surprise or fear in her eyes, only a deep, burnt-out professional boredom. "Of course you are, dear. The machine's just glitching. Third time this week. They'll fix it." Her voice was flat, devoid of intonation. She didn't even come closer to check my pulse, to lean in, to listen to my breathing. Her gaze returned to the tablet, and the breathing behind the screen grew closer. The shadow behind the white fabric shifted. Now it seemed taller, more massive. The rasping grew louder, clearer. I could have sworn I felt a slight movement of air, as if the screen's fabric had stirred from that breathing. "There's someone," I squeezed out, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. The nurse frowned, looking up from her tablet for a second. She looked at the screen, then at me. "There's no one else in the room, dear. Your roommate, Marfa Ignatievna, was discharged today. You mustn't get upset after surgery. Sleep." She turned and walked out, her footsteps fading down the hall. I was left alone. The flat green line of my death, the monotonous beep, and it behind the screen. I was alone with that breathing, which was now the only sound that held any meaning in this insane world. It was real, more real than the nurse's indifference. more real than the lying monitor. Time passed. A minute, an hour, I couldn't tell. I lay there staring at the screen, frozen, trying not to breathe so I could hear it better, to understand what it was doing. And it was only doing one thing, breathing, and getting closer. The shadow shifted again. Now, it was right at the seam where the two panels of the screen met. I could see a vague outline, tall with sloping, unnaturally narrow shoulders. The HUD seemed too elongated. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. The pain in my abdomen sharpened, became hot and alive, unlike my numb limbs. I tried to jerk away again, to break free from this bed, and this time my arm obeyed with difficulty. My fingers slid over the cold metal of the railing. The breathing hissed louder. It sounded impatient, anticipatory. The screen trembled. One edge moved an inch, revealing a narrow strip of space behind it. Darkness. I stared, holding my breath, my eyes aching from the strain. Something pale flickered in the gap. Something like a pale, long finger, with a nail of a strange, purplish hue. It rested on the edge of the screen, as if preparing to push it aside. The monitor's beep quickened, turning into a continuous, piercing shriek. The green line remained perfectly flat. I squeezed my eyes shut, frozen in terror. This is a dream. Post-operative delirium. Morphine hallucinations. It will pass soon. A doctor will come soon and explain everything. I heard a creak. Slow, drawn out. I opened my eyes. The screen was being moved. It slid smoothly across the floor, revealing what was behind it. There was no one there. At least, nothing human. There stood a shadow, but not an absence of light. It was something dense, viscous, absorbing the weak night light from the window. A tall, emaciated silhouette, bent at angles that induced nausea, long, thin limbs to many joints, and a face, or rather, what should have been a face, an elongated oval devoid of features, except in the lower part a slit of a mouth from which that same rasping, gurgling breath emanated. A trickle of something dark slowly oozed from the slit, dripping onto the floor with a soft, disgusting click. It had no eyes, but I knew it was looking at me, with its entire faceless essence. I felt that gaze like physical pressure on my skin. The monitor's shriek peaked and suddenly cut off. Silence fell, broken only by the creature's gurgling breath. It took a step forward. Its movements were sharp, jerky, like a poorly controlled marionette. It hovered above the floor, not touching it. I desperately jerked away, finally breaking free from the paralysis. I scrambled to the very edge of the bed, pressing myself against the wall. The cold plastic of the monitor pressed into my back. "Don't come closer," I screamed, and this time my voice obeyed, filling the quiet room with a wild animal terror. The creature stopped, its head tilted to the side, as if studying a strange insect. The eyeless mask was pointed right at me. The breathing grew quieter but more intense, like a predator preparing to pounce. A sound came from its mouth slit, not a voice, not a language. It was a grinding, as if stones were being crushed deep underground. But I understood, not with my ears, but with something else, deep inside, in the most ancient, primal part of my brain. "Quiet, do not interfere."
"What do you want?" I whispered, feeling tears stream down my temples. The creature stretched out its long, bony arm. That same pale finger with the purple nail pointed, not at me, at the monitor behind my back. I turned around, frozen in an awkward, hunched position. The screen was dead, dark, but across it, like a ghost, the same flat green line was slowly crawling. And below it numbers, pulse, 0, pressure, 0 zeroths, oxygen. It was showing me the truth. The one the nurse had believed. The creature made the grinding sound again, mine, and then it hit me. It hadn't come for me. It had come for what was on the monitor, for my death, for those zeros. It was a collector, an orderly, the one who appears when the final alarm sounds. But my alarm hadn't stopped, and I hadn't died. I was stuck somewhere in between, and it had broken some mechanism, attracted something that wasn't supposed to see me. It took another step, It smelled of copper, old bandages, and damp earth. I recoiled, and my hand found the call button on the bedside panel. I pressed it as hard as I could, not taking my eyes off the creature. A bell rang somewhere. Muffled, distant, the creature flinched. Its faceless head snapped toward the door, then back to me. Its breathing now held rage, impatience. It was hesitating, and that was against the rules. Mine, it growled inside my head. Give it. It lunged forward. I screamed, covering myself with the blanket like a pitiful shield. Long, bony fingers with purple claws dug into the mattress next to my head. An icy cold radiated from its body. Its breath scorched my cheek, the smell of grave dampness and decay. I waited for the end, for the feeling of emptiness, for it to take what it had come for, but nothing happened. I opened my eyes. The creature was frozen above me, its mouth slit agape. A quiet, furious whisper came from it, like the hissing of dozens of snakes. It was looking through me. At the monitor, I turned around. On the dark screen, right over the green line, another one was faintly flickering. Red, uneven, jumping. And below it pulsed a number. 48, then 50, then 52. That was my heart beating. My real one, alive. It was fighting, refusing to give up. The orderly recoiled. It made a sound full of pure, inexpressible disappointment and malice. Its form trembled, grew less dense, like a shadow in the sun. Footsteps and grumbling sounded in the doorway. Now what is it? It was the same nurse's voice. The creature slowly, reluctantly retreated into the corner. Its form melted, dissolving into the darkness. The last thing I saw was its eyeless gaze, full of a promise to return. And then it was gone. The nurse walked into the room, squinting in the light. Press the button again? Calm down, will you? She glanced at my monitor. The screen was active again. The green curve of the pulse was jumping confidently and evenly in time with my real heart. The numbers were within normal limits. The nurse snorted with satisfaction. See? Everything's fine. The machine fixed itself. Sleep. She left, never suspecting what had happened. I was left alone, shaking, wet with cold sweat. I looked at the calmed monitor, at that false, lulling picture, and I knew the truth. It would be back. It knew my scent now, knew I had seen it, and the next time the green line ran across the screen, be it a glitch or the real end, it would appear not as an impersonal orderly. It would appear as a hunter coming to claim its missed prey. I can't take my eyes off the monitor. Every beep sends an icy stab down my spine. I listen for every rustle in the hallway. And I know that the most terrible thing is not to die. The most terrible thing is to wait for them to come for you. And to hear in the night silence a familiar, heavy, raspy breathing right behind the thin white screen.
The second story. The doctor on his morning rounds congratulated me on the successful amputation of my leg. But when I threw off the blanket, both my legs were in place. The words hung in the sterile hospital air, thick with the smell of antiseptic and decay. The doctor, a young guy with tired but kind eyes behind thin metal-framed glasses, was smiling. He held a tablet, his finger poised to make the next note. I froze, feeling goosebumps run down my spine, washing away the remnants of anesthetic oblivion. A minor accident. Just a scratched bumper and a blow to the head on the steering wheel. A concussion at most, a night under observation for paperwork's sake. No legs, no amputations. I jerked the blanket off sharply. My two legs stared back at me. Completely whole, unharmed, in blue hospital socks. I wiggled my toes, feeling the familiar, reassuring movement. My heart was pounding somewhere in my throat, beating a rhythm of panic. Are you joking? I rasped, and my voice sounded strange, broken. The smile on the doctor's face didn't flicker. He didn't even glance at my legs. Instead, he shook his head, his gaze sliding somewhere over my shoulder to the empty hospital bed opposite. I'm not talking to you, Mr. Henderson, he said calmly, and his words cut deeper than any scalpel. Please don't interrupt the rounds. Mr. Henderson, not Marconi. Not to me. At that very second, a sound came from under that very empty bed. A quiet, intermittent sound, like the squeak of unoiled wheels. It grew, turning into a suppressed, hysterical giggle, then into unrestrained, throaty, insane laughter. It was filled with such pure, soul-chilling joy that the hair on my arm stood on end. The doctor seemed to hear nothing. He made a note on his tablet and nodded toward the empty bed. "Well, excellent. You're in great spirits, I see. The nurse will change your dressing after breakfast." The laughter behind the bed died down, replaced by quiet, contented whimpers. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from that spot. The space under the bed was plunged into a deep shadow that seemed unnaturally thick, almost solid. "Doctor," I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Can't you hear that? There's someone there." The doctor finally looked at me, but his gaze was different now. Polite but detached, the way you look at difficult or confused patients. "Mr. Marconi, you've suffered a concussion. Confusion and minor hallucinations are within the normal range. Try to calm down. Your legs are perfectly fine, trust me." He said it softly, but his tone carried an unshakable certainty that he was the only one perceiving reality correctly. He nodded once more toward the empty bed. "Have a good day, Mr. Henderson. Glad to see you're in good spirits." And he left, leaving me alone with that quiet whimpering coming from under the bed opposite. Several hours passed. Maybe an eternity. I didn't take my eyes off that bed. The room was for 2 people, but the second one, mine, was clearly unoccupied. The bedside table was empty, no personal belongings, the bed itself made with army precision. But sounds came from there. At first it was just breathing. Deep even, as if someone was sleeping. Then, the rustle of a sheet, as if the sleeper was turning over. I pressed myself into the pillow, feeling paralyzing fear bind my arms and legs. It was a hallucination. It had to be. The doctor said so. Someone knocked on the door and I flinched, almost jumping out of bed. A nurse entered the room, a rosy-cheeked, vibrant woman in her 40s. She was carrying a breakfast tray. "Good morning, handsome," she chirped cheerfully. "How are we feeling? The doctor said you're a bit fuzzy-headed." She put the tray on my bedside table and turned to the empty bed. From underneath it came the sounds of slurping and smacking, as if an invisible mouth was devouring porridge. "Wonderful. Eat up, Mr. Henderson," the nurse said, looking at the void. "Look, what a lovely cottage cheese." I watched this, and my own breakfast stuck in my throat. She wasn't pretending. Her smile was genuine, directed at someone she truly saw. She adjusted a non-existent wrinkle in the blanket on that bed. "Nurse," my lips barely obeyed. "Please tell me, do you see him?" She turned to me and her smile changed to an expression of pity. "You poor thing. Don't worry, it will pass. It's just the injury. You'll see, you'll be right as rain by evening." She came over to me, checked my temperature, my pulse. Her touch was real, solid. "And your Mr. Henderson is a dear. So quiet, so polite. No trouble at all." She left, leaving me in the company of a ghost happily eating his cottage cheese. The day dragged on agonizingly, slowly. I couldn't sleep, couldn't read, couldn't tear my eyes away from that half of the room. The invisible neighbor behaved like a normal patient. He tossed and turned, sighed, sometimes hummed a disjointed tune under his breath. The sounds were absolutely real, tangible. They came from one specific point in space. By evening, my nerves were shot. I had to prove to myself that I was going crazy, or find another explanation. I took my glass of water and threw it with force at the empty bed. The plastic thudded against the bed frame and fell to the floor, spilling water, and immediately from under the bed came an indignant, frightened cry. A man's voice, hoarse and old. "Hey, what are you doing? Are you crazy?" I froze, stunned. This didn't sound like a hallucination. It was a real voice coming from the void. The duty nurse, the same one, ran into the room. "What's going on here?" she asked sternly. I pointed a trembling hand at the bed. "Him," he screamed. "Did you hear him?" The nurse looked at the empty bed and her face showed extreme irritation. She turned to me. Mr. Marconi, this is beyond the pale. Mr. Henderson was sleeping peacefully and you're throwing glasses at him. I understand you're unwell, but this is unacceptable. But I didn't throw it at him. There's no one there, I shouted, feeling the ground disappear from under my feet. I can see you perfectly well, young man. The same hoarse voice came from under the bed, full of resentment. A nutcase for a neighbor. Nurse, can't you move me? The nurse sighed and walked over to the empty bed. Forgive him, Mr. Henderson, he's not himself. We'll clean this up right away. She picked up the glass from the floor and wiped up the water with a cloth she seemed to have brought specifically for this. She soothed the void, cooing, "It's all right, no harm done. You go back to sleep." The world had turned upside down. They all saw him, heard him, communicated with him, and I was the crazy one to them, the troublemaker who couldn't see the obvious. The night brought new horrors. I didn't sleep. The main lights in the room were turned off. Only a dim nightlight by the door remained. The shadows grew long, ominous. First there was a creak. Metallic, sharp. I raised myself on my elbows. The shadow on the wall from the empty bed changed. It wavered as if someone was sitting on the bed and rocking. Then, the sound of footsteps. Heavy, shuffling. They sounded right there on that floor where no one was. They walked around the bed and headed toward me. I froze, unable to move. Cold sweat streamed down my temples. The footsteps stopped a meter from my bed. I felt someone's gaze on me. It smelled of old age, medicine, and something sweetly rotten. A quiet, hoarse whisper sounded right at my ear, though I saw nothing in front of me. "Do you see me?" I didn't answer. Couldn't. My breath caught. The whisper became angry, sarcastic. "But you should. You're in my place." The footsteps retreated. I heard the sound of someone lying down on that bed. The blanket rustled. Then, complete silence. Towards morning, exhausted, I fell into a short, troubled sleep. I dreamed that I was lying on that bed, and that same doctor was standing over mine, congratulating me on a successful amputation. I scream that it's not me, but he doesn't hear. I was awakened by voices, the morning rounds, the same doctor and 2 nurses, so everything is on track, the doctor was saying, addressing the empty bed. "We'll remove the stitches in a week, and then you can go home, Mr. Henderson." He turned to me. His face was serious. "Mr. Marconi, we need to talk about your behavior. You are harassing other patients. This is unacceptable." I wasn't listening to him anymore. I was looking at the empty bed, and I suddenly understood everything. This wasn't about me, but it concerned me directly. "Doctor," I interrupted him, and my voice sounded surprisingly calm. "What happened to Mr. Henderson?" "With his leg?" The doctor frowned, surprised by the question. "What does that have to do with anything?" "You need to apologize." "Please!" The former hysteria sounded in my voice. "Just tell me." The doctor sighed and glanced at his tablet. "Gangrene, complications from advanced diabetes. The below-the-knee amputation was successful. Now the question is about a prosthesis." He kept talking, but I didn't hear him anymore. The puzzle pieces came together into a terrifying picture. They saw him. They treated him. They operated on him. But he wasn't there. His body, his physical shell, was absent. But his presence, his pain, his story, remained. Tethered to this place, to this bed. They were treating a ghost, and I had ended up in his room, on his territory. And now he, this invisible old man, resentful of the whole world, whose body was perhaps long in the grave, while his consciousness was stuck here in this hospital room, had decided to socialize. "We'll find a new place, a new body." I was silent all day. I observed. The nurses continued to care for the invisible man. Change the dressings on his non-existent leg. Bring him food that, judging by the smacking sounds, he ate with appetite, and at night it happened again. Footsteps. They approached my bed again. This time I felt pressure on the edge of the mattress. Someone invisible was sitting on my bed, breathing. That same hoarse, wheezing breath. "I'm lonely here," the voice whispered. "They are nice, but they're not real. They can't feel me, but you can feel." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop. "You're in my place. Time to switch." I felt an icy touch on my right leg. Exactly like a surgeon's before an operation, when he marks the incision line. The cold penetrated through the blanket, through the skin, right into the bone. I screamed. I screamed as I had never screamed in my life. The duty orderly, a burly guy, burst into the room. He turned on the light. "What now?" he barked. "He's here, on my bed, touching me." I was gasping for air, pointing a finger at the empty space by my feet. The orderly looked there, then at me. His face twisted in disgust. "There's no one there, nutcase. Go to sleep." At that moment, from the other side of the room came a quiet, contented chuckle, the same one that had started it all. The orderly turned his head. His gaze momentarily became uncertain, confused. He seemed to listen, but then shook his head and stared at me again. "Last warning. One more performance and we'll restrain you." "Understood?" He left, turning off the light. I sat there, hugging my knees, shaking. The icy spot on my leg could still be felt. The laughter died down. Now, from over there came quiet, steady snoring. He was asleep, on my bed, in his place. In the morning, I demanded immediate discharge. I yelled, threatened, begged. The doctor, after consulting with the nurses, threw up his hands. "Your vitals are normal, Mr. Marconi. The concussion appears to have been mild, but your psycho-emotional state, we'd like our psychiatrist to examine you. It was a nightmare. They weren't going to let me go. They thought I was a violent madman, and my invisible neighbor was a model patient. I realized there was only one way out. I had to play by their rules, acknowledge him. When lunch was brought, I gathered all my courage and turned to the empty bed. Mr. Henderson?" My words sounded unnaturally loud. "I apologize for yesterday. I was not myself." Silence hung in the room. Then a displeased grumble came from under the bed. Some neighbor they picked. "A nutcase." The nurse, setting down the tray, beamed. "You see, Mr. Marconi." Wonderful. Peace and friendship. From that moment on, I began to behave normally. I greeted the void, wished it good night, pretended the light from its nightlight bothered me. The medical staff was delighted. My treatment was going successfully, and the nightly visits stopped. Now he just slept in his bed, or pretended to. Sometimes I caught his gaze on me. Invisible, heavy, studying. He was waiting. Finally, the day of discharge arrived. The doctor signed my papers, repeating that I should see a neurologist and take a course of sedatives. I was getting dressed, feeling that empty bed behind me. I knew he was watching. I hurried, trying not to look back. "Leaving?" A hoarse voice sounded behind me. I turned around. The room was empty except for me. "Yes," I whispered. "It's time for me to go." A long sigh followed. Pity. We became such good friends. "Who will talk to me now?" There was no anger in his voice, no threat. Only infinite, all-consuming melancholy that made my blood run cold. I didn't answer. I ran out of the room without looking back, flew down the corridor headlong, suppressing the desire to scream. I burst outside, and the blinding sun hit my face. I took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling the tremors gradually subside. I was free. I had escaped. I walked along the sidewalk, almost starting to believe it was all over, that it was just a nightmare born of injury. At the intersection, the light turned red. I stopped. An elderly man stood next to me, leaning on a crutch. On his right leg, his trousers were tucked into a high sock, outlining the shape of a stump. He turned to look at the cars. Our eyes met, and I recognized those eyes. Tired, extinguished, hollow. The very eyes I was sure had been watching me from the void all those days. He smiled, a familiar, toothless, soul-chilling smile. "Well then," he whispered hoarsely, and his voice was audible through the street noise. "Shall we go together?" And his crutch, clattering on the asphalt, beat out that same rhythm. Thump, drag, like the footsteps of an invisible man on a hospital floor. The red light changed to green. The crowd started moving across the road, and I remained standing there, unable to move a single muscle, watching the retreating figure on crutches, feeling an icy hand squeezing my perfectly healthy, whole leg. The third story. The nurse gave me a painkiller, and a minute later I could read the thoughts of the surgeon preparing for my operation. The words hit me not as sound, but as pure, unfiltered essence bursting directly into my brain. It wasn't like hearing a voice. It was like a realization, sudden and terrifyingly clear, as if my own neurons had suddenly started processing someone else's mental clutter. The pain, the very same that just a minute ago was tearing my abdomen apart with white-hot knives of fire, was gone. Completely. Absolutely. It was replaced by a chilling void. And in that void, he began to speak. Manhattan Central Hospital. Blinking ambulance lights, shouts from orderlies, urgent night admission. I'd just had dinner at a questionable burger joint. Just a stomach ache that within a couple of hours had turned into a hellish storm. Appendicitis? Peritonitis? The EMTs, frowning, shook their heads, muttered something about an atypical presentation, and rushed me to surgery. The nurse, a woman with a tired but kind face, gave me an encouraging smile before inserting the IV. "Don't worry, Jack. This is a new drug, Cilanx, a miracle of pharmacology. It'll take the pain right away, and you'll stay conscious. Everything will be fine." She injected a clear liquid into the IV. A cold wave ran through my vein, and a moment later the world turned upside down. The pain was gone, but its place was taken by something indescribably more monstrous. First, it was just a hum, a low-frequency, intrusive hum, like a transformer buzzing. Then the hum broke into individual notes, words, images. It wasn't a stream. It was an ocean of someone else's thoughts crashing down on my defenseless mind. I was lying on a gurney in a narrow pre-op bay. Behind a thin wall in the next operating room, someone was preparing for work, and his brain, his most intimate, unrestrained thoughts, were invading me with terrifying clarity. All right, let's begin. Wonder what Linda made for dinner. Hope it's not that tuna pasta of hers again. Gives me heartburn for 2 days. The thoughts were flat, devoid of emotional color. A statement of facts. The internal monologue of a man completely absorbed in routine. So where is this appendix of his? Ah, there you are. God, what a mess inside. All covered in adhesions. Who let it get this bad? Liver looks like an old sponge after a party. Should suggest he sees a hepatologist later. Although no extra questions. I felt something moving inside me, in my own abdominal cavity. A cold touch of an instrument, but I felt no pain, only pressure, and this horrifying voiceover. Someone has to fix this. Always me, like a janitor. Cleaning up other people's biological mess. Okay, resecting. Carefully, carefully. It was him, the surgeon. Dr. Evans, as I later learned from his own thoughts. 45 years old, 20 of them at the operating table. Disappointed in his wife, in his kids who don't respect him, in medicine that has turned into a conveyor belt. His thoughts were saturated with cynical boredom. Another vessel. Bleeding. I'll clamp it. Doesn't matter, not critical. It'll thrombose on its own. Extra sutures mean extra risk of adhesions. We'll tell the relatives there was extensive bleeding due to inflammation. They won't check anyway. Horror, icy and nauseating, gripped me tighter than any paralysis. He was doing something wrong on purpose. He was saving time. He was playing with my life, thinking about his stupid tuna pasta. I tried to scream, to order him to stop, to explain that I knew everything, I could hear everything, but my body was a dead weight. Cilanx had done its job. It took away the pain, but it also paralyzed all my voluntary muscles. I couldn't move a finger, couldn't make a sound. I was locked in my own body, as if in a coffin, with headphones piping in the scariest horror movie ever made. A live report of my own carelessly performed surgery. Well, that seems to be it. Now irrigation, wash and clean. Can't wait to get home. New series of Surgeons premieres tonight. Haha, the irony. I'll watch those actors messing around in the dirt. I felt cold saline solution pouring inside me. His thoughts flowed smoothly without tension. For him, it was Tuesday. Sutures. I could do it layer by layer, nice and neat. But why? There'll be a scar anyway. Quick. A continuous suture and done. The main thing is a sepsis. The skin will heal anyway. The needle entered the flesh. The thread pulled through. I felt every movement, every bite of the skin, but without pain, only as a distant, detached, mechanical action. And it was accompanied by a soul-chilling commentary. Oh well, not a masterpiece, but it'll do. Next. The thought hit like a whip crack. Next, I was just an object on a conveyor belt. Another problem to be quickly disposed of. The gurney was wheeled out of the operating room. The stream of Dr. Evans's thoughts began to weaken, to fade, like a radio station dying out as you drive away from the city. The last thing I caught was a thought about whether he should remember to pick up sushi on the way home, since Linda had made her pasta again. I lay in the recovery room, unable to move, staring at the white ceiling. A quiet hysteria raged inside me. I was alive. The surgery was over. But at what cost? What had he done inside me? What had he clamped? What was not critical? The paralysis gradually receded. First I could move my fingers, then my arm. My throat was still tight, but I could already make hoarse sounds. The nurse, the same one who gave me the injection, approached me. "So, how are you, Jack?" Did silence do the trick? No pain? Her face shone with professional pride. "Doctor," I rasped, and my voice was foreign, exhausted. "Dr. Evans, Oh, so you've met. He's our best surgeon. You're very lucky he was on duty. Everything went brilliantly, quickly. You have no idea how bad the inflammation was." My breath caught. She didn't understand. She only saw the result, a operated patient. She hadn't heard his thoughts. He missed something. Inside. I tried to find words to explain the inexplicable. The nurse frowned, her smile fading. She touched my forehead. "Jack, that's post-operative euphoria and the residual effect of the drug. Hallucinations, confusion are possible. You need to rest. Dr. Evans did everything perfectly." She left, leaving me alone with my horror. Who would believe me? If I told them I could read minds, they'd transfer me to a psych ward instantly. The night was endless. I listened to every rustle inside myself. A twinge here, a pull there. Is this normal, or is that not critical vessel making itself known? In the morning, the rounds came, led by that very Dr. Evans. He was younger than I had pictured from his mind. Salt and pepper hair, fit with intelligent, tired eyes. The perfect picture of a doctor from an expensive clinic. "So how's our patient?" His voice was velvety, calm, full of confidence. "Everything went well. No complications. Neat little suture. We'll discharge you in a week." He looked at me and his eyes were empty. There was nothing in them of that cynical, world-weary man whose thoughts I had heard. And then I picked up a weak, barely perceptible signal. Like static, a fragment of a thought. "Need to get more sleep, these bags under my eyes." It was him, his inner voice. The silence was leaving my system. Its effect was weakening. But some neural connection, once opened, hadn't fully closed yet. I could still hear him, faintly, like a whisper from the next room. I stared at him, and he, feeling my gaze, frowned slightly. What's he staring at? Another hypochondriac, probably. Now he'll start asking about every stitch. Are you sure everything is okay?" I forced out. His face broke into a professional, lifeless smile. "Absolutely, Jack. Don't worry. Everything is under control." Of course it's under control. Should I tell him I almost nicked half his liver while digging out that damn appendix? But why scare the patient? And implicate myself? I felt everything inside me go cold. Half his liver? He didn't say anything. He just stitched me up and pretended everything was fine. I had to do something. But what? Accuse him? Say, "I know what you were thinking about my liver." The rounds moved on. Evans nodded at me and left. But my receiver kept working. I heard his thoughts as he walked down the hall. The lab called about the patient in 314. Bilirubin is through the roof. Should check on that, but later after coffee. Damn, those insurance clerks again with their paperwork. I hate this bureaucracy. He was thinking about work, about papers, about coffee. And amidst this stream, fleeting, terrifying admissions of negligence that drowned in the routine like stones in a swamp. That day, I was transferred to a regular room. The effect of the drug finally wore off, and the ability to hear thoughts faded. But the silence in my head was worse than any noise. Now I was left alone with my paranoia, with the knowledge that inside me was a time bomb planted by indifferent hands. Every day I waited for something to rupture, tear, become inflamed. Every visit from the nurse with a thermometer felt like a harbinger of disaster. But the days passed, and nothing terrible happened. The suture was healing. The pain was almost gone. I was almost managing to convince myself that it was all a delusion. A terrible side effect of Silinx, once before discharge. Evans came by to sign my paperwork. Well, Jack, that's it. Congratulations. Take it easy for a couple of months. Diet. No heavy lifting. He handed me my file. And at that moment, completely unexpectedly, my gift returned for a second. Like a short circuit. Something clicked in my brain, and I heard his thought, crystal clear, as he looked at my test results with an indifferent expression. Lucky guy. Could have gone the other way. Need to be more careful with the electrocautery next time. He smiled at me, suspecting nothing, turned around and left. I sat on the bed, clutching the discharge papers, and the whole world around me lost all stability. It wasn't a delusion. It was real. And this man, this best surgeon, was still operating. Right now, he was probably going to another OR, to another Jack, to think about sushi and TV shows while something inside someone else bled, not critically. I was discharged. I returned to life, but I was a different person. I couldn't trust doctors. I couldn't trust anyone. I constantly listened to my own body, searching for symptoms of non-existent diseases planted in my head by his indifferent thoughts. I found out that Silinx had been recalled from the market. It turned out it had a rare side effect, causing temporary, pronounced paranoid hallucinations. For the pharmaceutical company and the doctors, that was the definitive explanation. But I knew the truth. Sometimes, passing by the central hospital, I would stop and look at its gleaming windows. Somewhere in there was he, Dr. Evans, and his scalpel, and his thoughts, and I knew that the most terrible thing wasn't the pain. The most terrible thing was to know that your life, your body, is just a backdrop for someone's boring, mundane, lethally dangerous thoughts. And you are utterly powerless against this knowledge. Once on the subway, I saw him. He was riding in the same car, tired, in civilian clothes, reading something on his phone. We were standing a few steps apart. He was just a man. Not a monster, not a villain, just a tired, disappointed specialist. And as the train rushed through the darkness of the tunnel, I looked at him and couldn't shake a single obsessive thought spinning in my head. And I desperately hoped he himself didn't have any Silinx in his blood to hear it. I wonder what he's thinking about right now. The fourth story. All the patients in my ward lay with their eyes closed and didn't move. But at night, their sheets were covered in fresh blood stains. The air in Ward 307 was thick and still, smelling of bleach, old age, and something sweetly cloying that Charles Lewis couldn't identify, but that made his stomach clench with anxiety. For him, a 40-year-old man of athletic build, used to marathon runs and boardroom battles as a financial analyst, this stillness seemed unnatural, depraved. He had been brought here after a ridiculous incident, a sharp pain in his side during his morning jog, a diagnosis of acute pancreatitis attack, urgent hospitalization. He was placed in a 6-bed general ward, and from the very first minute, something felt wrong. His neighbors. There were 5 of them. They didn't moan, toss and turn, or call for the nurse. They just lay there, perfectly still, eyes closed, hands neatly on top of the blankets. Their breathing was so quiet and shallow that Charles kept catching himself staring intently at one or another neighbor's chest, trying to detect movement. They seemed to be in a deep coma or under a massive dose of sedatives. But then why were they here, in a general ward, and not in the ICU or intensive care unit? The first night became torture for him. The pain had subsided thanks to the IV drips, but it was replaced by a primal, uncontrollable fear. The lights in the ward were dimmed, leaving only a dull nightlight by the door, casting long, dancing shadows. That's when he heard it, the squeak of wheels, slow, measured, approaching down the corridor. The door to the ward opened silently. On the threshold stood an orderly, a tall, stooped man in a white coat too big for him. His face was hidden in shadow, but Charles felt his heavy, sliding gaze upon him. The orderly was pushing a small metal cart ahead of him, loaded with something covered by a white cloth. He didn't look at Charles. He headed to the first bed, to an elderly man with grey, stubbly cheeks. The squeak of the wheels died down. The orderly froze for a few moments, as if checking an invisible list. Then his hand slipped under the cloth on the cart. A quiet, metallic clang sounded like from tools. Charles, holding his breath, half closed his eyes, leaving a narrow slit. He couldn't see what exactly the orderly was doing. His back was blocking the view, but he heard a quiet, wet sound like cutting dense fabric. A restrained sigh escaping the old man's chest. The first sound Charles had heard from him the entire time. But it wasn't a sound of pain, more like relief. Then, a soft rustling, the sound of a dressing being changed, the clink of something metal being dropped into a metal tray. The procedure took no more than 3 minutes. The orderly moved to the next bed, and repeated the same thing, and again, the same set of quiet, horrifying sounds. A cut, a sigh, rustling, clanging. He went around all 5. He worked silently, methodically, with a terrifying, practiced precision of an automaton. Not a word, no unnecessary movement. When he left, wheeling his sinister cart away, Charles lay in a stupor, covered in sticky, cold sweat. He didn't sleep a wink until morning. The morning light flooding the ward brought no relief. It brought proof. A nurse, a cheerful and lively girl, began her rounds. She checked monitor readings, adjusted IV drips, and when she pulled back the blanket of the first neighbor to listen to his breathing, Charles saw it. The snow-white sheet under the old man's body was stained with scarlet, fresh smears. They showed through around the abdominal area, bright, terrifyingly real. The nurse, without changing her expression, neatly changed the sheet, wiped the patient's skin with antiseptic, applying a fresh gauze bandage over a neat, almost invisible wound under the dressing. She did it as routinely as making a bed. Charles felt the blood drain from his face. He watched as she did the same with each of his 5 neighbors. Everyone had fresh bloodstains on their sheets. Everyone had fresh wounds hidden under bandages. What's wrong with them? He rasped, barely finding the strength to speak. The nurse turned to him with a sunny smile. "Oh, don't worry, Mr. Lewis. It's just drains. Post-operative procedures. Everything is completely fine." Her cheerfulness was so unnatural, so detached from what was happening, that Charles felt a chill inside. She was either lying or just as out of her mind as everyone else here. "But they don't move. They don't wake up," he insisted. "They are prescribed strict bed rest and special medication support." Her voice became slightly harder, the smile not reaching her eyes. "You shouldn't worry either. You need to rest." She quickly finished her rounds and left, leaving him alone with 5 living corpses and the knowledge that some bloody manipulations were performed on them every night. All day, Charles tried to catch the doctor's eye during rounds, tried to question the other shift of nurses. Everyone said the same thing: drains. Standard procedures, none of your business. Their eyes were glassy, detached. He was the only one who saw the madness happening. By evening, he understood. He would be the next target. Tonight, that orderly would approach his bed. Panic threatened to turn into hysteria, but Charles was not one to give up. His mind, sharpened for risk analysis and finding weak spots, began to work. Run. He was weak, tethered to an IV. Scream. Who would hear? The medical staff was clearly in on it. There was only one option left. Learn the truth. See it with his own eyes. He decided to pretend to be asleep. When lights out was announced in the department, Charles was ready. He lay on his side, facing the aisle, and closed his eyes, leaving a tiny gap between his eyelashes. His heart was pounding so loudly it seemed to echo through the quiet ward. Every minute of waiting stretched into an eternity, and then he heard it. The familiar squeak, slow, relentless, like a chariot of death approaching his bed. The door opened. A tall, stooped figure rolled into the ward against the backdrop of the dim light from the corridor. The cart, the white cloth. The orderly unhurriedly began his usual route. First bed, second, third. Charles watched him, holding his breath, feeling his muscles tense to the point of cramping. He prayed that he would just pass by, but no. After doing his gruesome work with the other patients, the orderly headed towards him. The squeak of the wheels died down right at his bedside. Charles lay still, not moving, imitating the deep, even breathing of a sleeping person. He felt a heavy, studying gaze upon him. It smelled of formalin, old blood, and something chemical and coppery. The orderly's hand reached for the cart. His fingers, long and bony, with pale, almost bluish skin, grabbed the edge of the white cloth and pulled it back, and through the slit of his squinted eyelids, Charles saw it. On the cart, there were no syringes, no medicine jars, or stacks of clean bandages. Under the cloth lay surgical instruments, shiny, sterile, clean, razor-sharp, serrated forceps, tweezers with sharp tips, and most importantly, a long, curved, mirror-polished scalpel. Its blade, even in the dim light, cast a sinister, cold glint. These were not instruments for changing drains. These were instruments for cutting, for dissection. Charles's heart stopped, then raced in a frantic gallop. He barely suppressed a scream ready to tear from his throat. His whole body tensed, ready to jump, to fight. The orderly picked up the scalpel, held it with a familiar, professional ease. His other hand reached for Charles's blanket to pull it back, and at that moment their eyes met. Charles couldn't take it. His eyes flew wide open in horror. He could no longer pretend. He saw the orderly's face, ordinary, wrinkled, with tired bags under his eyes. But the eyes were completely empty, devoid of any thought, any empathy, any humanity. They were like those of a fish washed ashore. He looked at Charles but didn't see a human being. He saw an object, material. Not a single muscle twitched on the orderly's face. No surprise, no anger at being discovered. There was only a slight, barely noticeable irritation, as if from a minor technical glitch. His hand with the scalpel froze in the air. He didn't flinch. He just stood there staring with his glassy eyes. "Don't come closer," Charles hissed, scrambling toward the wall, getting tangled in the IV line. His voice sounded weak and frightened, not at all like he wanted. The orderly was silent. He slowly lowered the scalpel, but not onto the cart. He just held it in his hand, as if considering whether to continue despite everything. Then his empty gaze slid over Charles from head to toe, lingering on the trembling hands gripping the mattress. He saw his fear, saw his resistance, and then the corners of his lips twitched into something that was meant to be a smile. It was the most terrifying thing Charles had ever seen. The orderly slowly, almost theatrically, brought a finger to his bloodless lips. Shh. A quiet, hissing sound, full of inhuman patience and promise. Then he just as slowly covered the instruments with the cloth, turned his cart around, and wheeled it out of the ward without haste. The squeak of the wheels faded down the corridor. Charles sat on the bed, trembling all over, struggling to catch his breath. Adrenaline flooded his bloodstream. He was alive. He had avoided the fate of his neighbors. But that look, that gesture, that silent shh, it wasn't a warning. It was a stay of execution. He looked at his neighbors. They lay motionless, as always. Their chests rose and fell almost imperceptibly. On the fresh sheets, just changed by the nurse after the nightly rounds, new scarlet stains were already appearing. And then the terrible truth dawned on Charles. They weren't in a coma. They weren't asleep. They were conscious. They felt everything. Every touch of the scalpel, every cut. But they couldn't move, couldn't scream. They were paralyzed, locked inside their own bodies. And every night this insane, bloody procedure was performed on them. And in the mornings their bloody linen was changed with fake smiles. And now he, Charles Lewis, knew their terrible secret. And he had become a part of this silent, motionless nightmare. His quiet neighbors, his eternal, suffering cellmates. He understood that he wouldn't get out of here, not because he was sick, but because he had seen. And now he had to make a choice, join their eternal, silent suffering, or become the next victim of the nightly visit with the cart that held not a syringe, but a large, sharp scalpel. The fifth story. Someone had drawn a small smiley face in red marker on my medical chart, and each day there were more of these drawings. I first noticed it the morning after the night they brought me to this hospital with excruciating abdominal pain. The diagnosis was gallstones. The operation was straightforward, laparoscopic, almost a joke by modern standards. Me, Michael Memphis, an ordinary accountant from quiet Grand Rapids, Michigan, was put in a semi-private room, though I had no roommate yet. I was lying there, trying to read a book on my tablet, when my gaze fell on the plastic cover of my medical chart hanging at the foot of the bed. And I saw it. A small, neat smiley face drawn in red ballpoint pen, 2 dot eyes and a neat arc of a smile. It seemed cute. Must be some kind nurse or orderly trying to cheer up the patients. I smiled back at the invisible artist and forgot about it. The next day, there were 3 smileys. They were next to the first one, just as neat, but seemingly drawn with more pressure. The red ink had slightly indented the plastic. I even showed them to Nurse Lisa, a sweet girl with freckles who was setting up my IV. "Look," I said. "Someone's made a habit of doodling on my medical history." "Cute." Lisa leaned over, looked where I was pointing, and her eyebrows rose. She looked at me, then back at the cover. Her face showed pure, genuine bewilderment. "What's cute?" she asked. "There's nothing there," I laughed, thinking she was joking. "What do you mean, nothing?" "Right here, 3 of them, in red pen." She looked again, even squinting, then shrugged and said with a hint of concern in her voice, "Mr. Memphis, it's probably just the pre-op meds making you see things. The cover is clean, no drawings. You should rest." She left, and I spent another 10 minutes staring at the 3 distinct red smileys looking back at me from the plastic surface. They were so real, so tangible. I could trace them with my finger, but Lisa couldn't see them. By that evening, I counted 7. They were all over the cover. Their smiles seemed slightly wider, their dot eyes more intense. A cold, sticky anxiety stirred in my chest for the first time. I tried to rub one off with my finger. The plastic was smooth. The red ink wouldn't smudge, as if it were part of the material itself. An internal pattern that had surfaced. On the 3rd day, I woke up feeling like someone was watching me. I opened my eyes and looked first at the chart. It was covered in them. Dozens, if not hundreds, of smileys. They covered the entire surface of the cover, crawling over each other, creating an eerie, dense red pattern. But the worst part wasn't their number. The faces themselves had changed. Their smiles had stretched to incredible cartoonish sizes, reaching almost to the edges of their faces, turning into unnaturally wide, ear-to-ear grimaces. These were no longer smiles of happiness, but leers, grimaces of pure, unadulterated joy bordering on madness. The eyes remained dots, but now they stared at me with a silent, idiotic delight. Goosebumps ran down my spine. This wasn't cute. It was disgusting and frightening. I snatched the chart from its holder and, limping, my legs were like jelly after all the tests and IVs, went to the duty nurse's station. This time it was an older, stern woman named Martha. "Look, please," I almost shouted, jabbing my finger at the cover. "Can't you see this? Who is drawing this? Is this some sick joke?" Martha took the chart, held it up to her eyes, turned it under the lamplight. Her face remained completely impassive. Then she looked at me with an expression of deep professional concern mixed with mild irritation. "Mr. Memphis," she said slowly, enunciating her words clearly as if speaking to a dim child. "There are no drawings on your chart. It is perfectly clean. Here is your name, your room number, your patient ID number. Nothing else. How can there be nothing?" My voice rose to a shrill pitch. "They're everywhere. Hundreds of these faces. Look, they're staring at us." I grabbed her hand and tried to force her finger to trace one of the most horrific stretched mouths. She jerked her hand away sharply. "You need to calm down." Her voice turned icy. "And return to your room. Otherwise, I will have to give you a sedative. Preoperative stress is normal, but you must get a grip." She handed the chart back to me. I looked at it. The smileys were still there. They seemed even brighter, even more mocking. You really don't see them?" I whispered, feeling the ground give way beneath me. "I see a clean medical chart," Martha stated, "and nothing more." That day, my surgeon, Dr. Evans, came by. Young, confident in an impeccably white coat. He quickly scanned my test results, palpated my abdomen, said everything was ready for tomorrow's surgery. With trembling hands, I showed him the chart. "Doctor, for God's sake, tell me you see this." He cast a distracted glance at the cover and flashed his Hollywood smile. "I see someone likes you, Michael. It's good when patients are cared for. Boosts morale." He patted me on the shoulder and left. He didn't see them either. Nobody did. Only me. By nightfall, the drawings had escaped the cover. They appeared on the white wall by the head of my bed. First one, then three, then a dozen. The same red, wildly grinning mouths with dot eyes. They stared at me from the ceiling, the floor, the nightstand. The red ink seemed to seep from the walls, forming these nightmarish patterns. I sat on the bed, pressed into the pillow, covers pulled over my head, and cried from helpless terror. I understood I was losing my mind. It was the only logical explanation. Hallucinations. Psychosis induced by fear of the operation. I prayed for it to end. To just fall asleep and wake up in the recovery room, where everything would be normal, where there would be no these horrible, laughing faces. I must have fallen asleep eventually because I woke up with a strange feeling. The room was dark, only the nightlight was on, but I felt a presence, and I heard a quiet scratching sound, like someone drawing on something rough. Slowly, afraid to move, I opened my eyes. By my bed, his back to me, sat an orderly. Tall, gaunt, in a white coat that hung on him like on a hanger. I couldn't see his face. He was focused on something, bent over my leg, which was in a cast from an old fracture, a precaution due to thrombosis risk. In his hand was not a syringe, not a thermometer. In his long, bony fingers he held a thick red marker, and he was drawing. I froze, paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move a single muscle, couldn't make a sound. I could only watch. The orderly, with a focused, almost obsessed expression, was drawing a new, enormous, smiley face on the white surface of the cast on my leg. It was bigger than all the previous ones. It covered almost the entire outer side of my shin. The orderly carefully, lovingly traced the arc of the mouth. This mouth was of monstrous size, stretched from one edge of the cast to the other, disappearing somewhere beneath it. It wasn't just drawn in red. The marker was thick, and the ink lay heavily, glossily, and in the light of the nightlight it looked wet, sticky, almost bloody. The orderly finished drawing the nightmarish mouth and started on the eyes. Two large, perfectly round dots. They stared right at me. Then he finished and paused for a second, admiring his work. Then slowly, very slowly, turned his head. I expected to see a monstrous face, disfigured by madness, another smiley instead of a face. But his face was completely normal. An ordinary, tired face of a man in his 50s with strong features and bags under his eyes. He looked at me. His eyes were empty, tired, like those of a person who has been doing a routine, boring job for 1,000 years. There was no malice, no madness, no joy in them. Only boredom. Our eyes met. He realized I wasn't asleep, that I saw everything, and nothing changed on his face. Not a shadow of surprise, fear, or anger. He just looked at me with his empty eyes. Then his lips stretched. Slowly, very slowly, the corners of his mouth crept upward toward his temples, stretching the skin, revealing yellow, uneven teeth. It was that smile, the very one drawn on the chart, on the walls, and now, on my cast. An unnaturally wide, ear-to-ear grimace, full of silent, idiotic delight. He didn't say a word. He just smiled at me with that dreadful, drawn smile, nodded like an artist pleased with his work, stood up, and silently left the room. I lay there, unable to move, unable to scream. I felt a weight on my leg, the weight of that drawing. In the morning, Lisa came to check my blood pressure. She was still cheerful and chatty. "So, Michael, ready for your big day?" "Oh, look," she pointed at my cast. "That's sweet. Someone left you a good luck message?" Slowly, afraid to look, I turned my eyes to my leg. The cast was clean. White, matte, untouched. No giant bloody mouth, but I knew it was there. I felt it under the bandage. I felt that drawn smile burning my skin, seeping inside, into the bone. And as they wheeled me into the operating room, and the anesthesiologist began to place the mask over my face, I saw all the doctors and nurses around me looking at me and smiling, widely, very widely, ear to ear. Their eyes were empty and bored, and on the forehead of the chief surgeon, right above his eyebrows, a small, neat, red, smiley face had appeared, as if seeping through the skin. The sixth story. Every night at exactly 3:04, footsteps and the squeak of a gurney's wheels would sound in the hallway, and it always stopped outside my room's door. It wasn't just a sound. It was the metronome of my nightly nightmare, its relentless, precise beat. 3:04 a.m., the time when the hospital held its breath, and something else awoke. The time when he came. My name is Russell Van Dyke. I returned from Iraq alive, but not whole. The war left no visible scars on me, but it burned my ability to sleep to ashes. What doctors politely called post-traumatic stress disorder was in reality a constant, exhausting state of high alert. My brain refused to shut down, refused to sink into the darkness where it could be caught off guard. That's how I ended up here in this sterile neurology ward, for medication adjustment. Essentially, they were pumping me full of a cocktail of tranquilizers and sleeping pills, trying to make me forget what my eyes had seen and my ears had heard, but no medication could drown out that sound. It started exactly at 3:04. First, measured heavy footsteps. Dull booming, as if someone in heavy, wet booties was walking down the empty corridor. They always started from the far end by the stairwell, and then the squeaking would join in, a nasty, high-pitched, shrieking squeak of unoiled wheels. A gurney. It always followed the footsteps. I would lie there, pressing into the mattress, clenching my teeth and count. 10 steps, pause, squeak, squeak, 15 more steps, another pause. My hearing, sharpened by years of night watches and patrols, picked up the slightest nuances. I knew where the squeaky floorboard lay in the hallway, and I heard the wheel ride over it and let out a plaintive cry. And the most terrifying part, the route never changed. The footsteps and squeaking would reach my room, number 312, and stop. Right outside my door, an absolute silence would follow, lasting exactly 3 minutes. I didn't breathe during those 3 minutes. I just lay there and waited. Then the sounds would start to recede in reverse order. First the squeak of the wheels, then the heavy retreating footsteps. And by 3:10, dead silence would reign in the corridor again. I tried to complain. The shift nurse, Olivia, a sweet girl, would just shake her head. "Mr. Van Dyke, no one goes around on gurneys here at night. The orderly on duty makes his rounds at 1:30, and then there's no one until morning. Are you sure it's not?" She would meaningfully tap her finger to her temple. I was sure. It wasn't a dream or a hallucination. It was as real as the ache in my once broken rib before rain. On the 4th night, my patience snapped. The soldier in me couldn't take the passive waiting. I had to see. I had to confirm I was right. At exactly 3:03, I threw off the blanket. The drugs made my movements sluggish. My foggy mind resisted, screaming that this was a bad idea. But I forced myself. I crept to the door, holding my breath. A cold draft and a faint smell of antiseptic came from under it. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, I pressed my eye to the round peephole. The corridor was plunged in semi-darkness, lit only by a few dim nightlights. And it was empty, no one. I was already tasting the bitterness of disappointment and the fear of a crazy diagnosis when I heard them. Footsteps, squeaking. They were already approaching. And there they were. Right opposite my peephole, the sound ceased, and I saw him. In the corridor, illuminated by the dim light, stood a gurney. An old one with a rusty frame and small, dull wheels. On it lay something oblong, covered by a white hospital sheet, its outline resembling a human body. But the most horrifying thing wasn't that. There was no one around, no orderly, no doctor, no ghost for that matter. The gurney with its mysterious load stood in the middle of the empty hallway all by itself. It was just waiting. I stared at that white mound, trying to make out something. The sheet lay motionless. No breathing, no trembling. Just a quiet, silent object. 3 minutes. It stood there for exactly 3 minutes. Then, without any visible reason, it moved. The wheel squeak resumed, and it slowly rolled back into the darkness of the corridor. No footsteps were heard, just a lonely, plaintive squeak. I crawled away from the door, drenched in cold sweat. My logic, my rational thinking, everything that had kept me sane all these years, was cracking at the seams. This was impossible. This couldn't be happening. The next night I was at the peephole again. Fear had been replaced by a desperate, almost insane determination. I had to understand exactly at 3:04 the sound stopped. And this time I saw it much closer. The gurney wasn't at the end of the corridor, but just a couple of meters from my door. I could make out the rust spots on its frame, the scratches on the plastic. The sheet still hid its burden. And again, not a soul around. My heart was pounding wildly. It had gotten closer. The third night of observation brought a new level of horror. The gurney was standing right at my door. I could barely see it through the peephole, just the edge of a rusty wheel and a white fold of the sheet, now centimeters away from me. I felt its presence with my skin, with every nerve ending. This wasn't just a cart. It was a threat. Mute, inexplicable, but utterly real. I told Olivia to go to hell when she started again about my anxious dreams. I demanded to speak to the chief physician, the head of the department. They politely but firmly explained that no nightly rounds were scheduled and no gurneys were used after 9 p.m. They were all parked by the elevator service room. They offered me new pills, stronger ones. I refused. I needed to be conscious. I needed to be ready. Tonight arrived with the inevitability of a verdict. I knew it couldn't go on like this. It was already at the door. There was no next step. I didn't sleep. I sat on the bed, my back against the wall, staring at the door handle. On the nightstand beside me lay a dinner knife clutched in my sweaty palm, which I'd managed to swipe during supper. It was a ridiculous weapon against what I was facing, but it gave a phantom sense of control. The clock on my phone showed 3:03. The silence behind the door was ringing. Oppressive 3:04. I froze, stopping my breath. I waited for the familiar squeak, waited for the footsteps, but there was nothing. Absolute silence. The same silence that usually followed the stop. But it had come immediately, without the preliminary sounds, as if it was already here, right outside the door, waiting for its hour. And then I understood. Tonight it hadn't stopped at the door. Tonight it had pulled up right against it. Cold sweat streamed down my back. I didn't take my eyes off the handle. Dark, matte metal, glinting in the moonlight from the window, and I saw it twitch. Almost imperceptibly, as if someone on the other side had barely touched it. My heart stopped. The handle began to turn. Slowly, unnaturally slowly. Silently, despite the old mechanism that usually creaked and complained. It turned with a measured, hypnotic smoothness. I watched its shape change under my gaze, saw it turn downward in the direction of opening. This was impossible. The door was locked from the inside with a latch, but the handle turned with the same relentless certainty, as if no lock existed at all. A click. Quiet, but deafening in the dead silence of the room. The latch was retracting. Now the door was unlocked. I jumped up from the bed, clutching the knife in my trembling hand. Adrenaline cut through the veil of drugs, sharpening the world to crystal clarity. I dropped into a low stance, ready to attack, to defend, for anything. The handle completed its turn, and stopped. Nothing happened. The door didn't open. No cold draft came from under it. No breathing, no squeaking was heard. Just that turned-down handle, a silent testament that access had been granted. A minute. 2. I didn't move, frozen in tension. And then a sound reached me. Not from behind the door, from above, a quiet rustling sound, as if someone was running a hand over the door on the other side. No, not a hand. Something heavy made of fabric. Slowly, very slowly, I raised my head, and I saw, through the crack between the door and the floor, a thin strip of light. The white edge of a sheet began to intrude. That same sheet from the gurney. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, it was creeping into my room. It was dirty with yellowish stains, and it smelled. It smelled of formalin and something sweetly rotten. I recoiled, clamping my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. The sheet crawled inward, alive. It was infinitely long. There was no one and nothing visible behind it, just this crawling fabric, filling the space under the door like a white, sinister tongue. It crept onto the floor of my room, spreading across it, moving toward my feet, and then I understood I had been wrong. I thought the gurney was the threat, but the gurney was just the transport. The sheet wasn't a covering. It was the entity itself, the very one that came every night, and now it was here. It was crawling into my room, silent, relentless, carrying with it the smell of death and hospital sterility, mingled into the most horrifying cocktail I had ever smelled. I retreated until my back hit the cold glass of the window. The white fabric slowly spread across the floor, coming toward me. There was nowhere to run, and then from the depths of this encroaching sheet came a sound, faint, barely perceptible, not a voice, not a whisper, but a quiet, dry squeak. The squeak of an unoiled wheel. It came from right inside that pile of fabric, as if it itself was the gurney, the very ghost, the very entity that had been knocking at my door all these nights, and now it was inside.